Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our last Occupational and Environmental Health Seminar of the year. The term is rapidly wrapping up here. We have been very lucky the last couple of weeks because we've had guests in from out of town for various conferences that have been happening. So today we continue with that trend with Adam Cohen. Adam Cohen is a research associate at the Transportation Sustainability Research Center at the Institute of Transportation Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. He joined the research group in 2004 and has focused his research on worldwide shared use mobility, including car sharing, bike sharing, ride sharing, and ride sourcing. He's co-authored numerous publications in peer-reviewed journals and conference proceedings. In 2008, he completed a dual master's degree in city and regional planning and international affairs from the Georgia Institute of Technology. He graduated from the University of California, Berkeley with a dual bachelor's degree in urban studies and legal studies, and I just asked him if he was going to do a dual PhD, and he said maybe. So welcome with us, Adam.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. So it's really great to be able to return to Vancouver. It's actually one of my favorite cities. So today I'm going to be talking to you guys about trends and future of shared use mobility. And I'm going to start out talking about demographic and technological changes that are driving some of these changes in transportation, some of the user behaviors and preferences, millennials in particular, the role of smartphone technology. And then I'm going to talk to you guys a little about shared use mobility, specifically the definitions and some three common modes of shared use mobility: car sharing, bike sharing, ride sharing, and then kind of a side note to that, for hire vehicle services, which have been kind of coined in the United States as either ride sourcing or transportation network companies. And then I'm going to conclude with a summary. So one of the trends that are kind of driving the sharing economy, kind of shared use mobility, is something that was coined by Kevin Kelly in terms of access trumps ownership. Kevin Kelly is the co-founder of Wired magazine, and he kind of compares transportation to kind of the internet economy to transportation, basically stating that people drive on roads, and roads are a shared resource that people don't typically pay per use on the roadway, and they don't have to maintain the roads or have the burden of of everything that goes along with that. And in a lot of ways, he compares the internet economy to the same kind of thing, that people go online, they go access Netflix or Amazon Prime or Hulu or whatever the service is, and they pay for a subscription, and they don't have to have the cost of owning it. They don't have to buy new DVDs every time a show comes out. They don't need to store them and things like that. So what Kevin Kelly kind of says is that access trumps possession, and that access is better than ownership. And we see this model kind of coming into the transportation realm, increasing with shared use mobility through various subscription type services. But it really only works if it's on demand and available whenever you need it. And so that's kind of one of the things that is kind of the catch there, is that in the internet economy, it works all the time because it's available on demand, and that we need to build our transportation system the same way if we want these alternatives to continue to be successful and viable. So some of the user behaviors and preferences, increasingly across the population, we are seeing more complex travel behavior, travel patterns. People are trip chaining, they're multitasking more. It's no longer point A to B, but it's point A to B to C to D, and then back home. And one of the things that we're also seeing, particularly among the younger generation, is that transportation is being used increasingly not as a mode for point A to point B, but as a mechanism of doing other things. People are reading their newspaper, they are surfing email, they are socializing, they're exercising. They're doing their transportation time frame is being used for multiple tasks. People are trying to use that extra hour or 2 hours in their day to get other things done. One of the benefits of that we're seeing is some health impacts from increased cycling and walking. These are shown to reduce a lot of health issues, related to skeletal issues, dementia, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, anxiety, depression, fatigue. It's really, really great across the board. And then the other thing is we're seeing less auto, it obviously improves air quality. So this here is a study by Dr. Pucher, who did a study of walking and cycling trends both in North America and in Europe. And he basically looked at to see kind of, what the trends were in comparison, and hands down, in North America, people were walking and cycling less. Here in Canada, about 2% of the study population reported bicycling, 10% walking on a regular basis. And then in the United States, it was even lower, 1% for bicycling and 6% for walking. And you can kind of compare to our European counterparts, particularly in Central Europe, where those numbers are much higher. This here is an infographic from Think with Google, generated with Statistics Canada data from 2012, basically showing the impact of the millennial population. This is the group of people that are born between 1981 and 2000. They account for 30% of Canada's population, 9.5 million people approximately, with earnings capacity of $237 billion. They represent 21% of Canada's earned income, and they're estimated to be 75% of the labor force here in Canada over the next 15 years. So this here is the generation that their trends are really going to be driving kind of mainstream society within the next 15 years, because they're going to represent 3/4 of the workforce. So the Transportation Cooperative Research Program did a study on millennials and mobility in 6 metropolitan cities across the United States. And their key findings from this was that cost, convenience, and exercise were the top motivators for millennial transportation choices. They also found that the decision to use multi-modes was being driven by cost and convenience and time savings. They're attracted to alternative modes from the digital aspect that provides real-time multimodal trip aggregation information. And what's interesting is the study also found that the decision to drive is largely about convenience and kind of avoiding hassles. So is driving going to be more or less convenient to find parking, more or less expensive to pay tolls, and things of that nature? The study also found that environmental considerations are a plus, they're a bonus, but not a core motivator for these decisions. And that was kind of an interesting takeaway from the study. And the final takeaway was that millennials are multitasking and that constant internet connectivity was key. So this here is a research infographic that was done based on an Insights West study. This is their infographic, basically showing smartphone use in British Columbia. At the time of this data, they had smartphone penetration in BC had soared to 64%. And the largest drivers of this was also the millennial population. In their study, 18 to 34-year-olds, representing 89% of smartphone use among that population. And you can see it's also high, fairly high, among the 35 to 54-year-olds, and it steadily drops off. They also found that men were slightly more likely to use smartphones than women. The study was also kind of interesting because one of the other things that they found was that smartphones are being used more often on a weekly basis than tablets or computers. And that people are using in BC smartphones almost as much as they watch TV on a weekly basis. About 13.7 hours compared to about 14 hours for watching TV. This also is from their study from Insights West, and they asked the question is, pet peeves, what are people's top pet peeves with smartphone or mobile users? And what was interesting is that only a small fraction of people admit to this, but these were represented the strongest pet peeves. So 87% said that they strongly disliked people using a smartphone while driving. 17%, though, admitted to doing this. 78% said the use of a mobile device during a movie upset people, but only 3% admitted to doing this. So this is really kind of a fascinating thing. Other top things that were disruptive were talking loudly in a public place, using a phone during meals, a whole slew of things. It's kind of interesting. So what role is kind of mobile and internet technologies having on our decisions to kind of get from point A to point B? We're seeing demographic shifts, improvement in cloud computing, technology, and wireless communications really impacting how we travel. The role of mobile apps is becoming increasingly focused not only on smartphones, but as well as tablets and other devices. People are using these apps to do a number of transportation functions, including vehicle routing, real-time data on congestion and roadway incidents, smart parking apps that look at availability and cost of parking, trip planning, and multimodal routing aggregation apps, as well as an advent of for-hire vehicle service apps, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later today. These are like your Ubers and your Lyfts. So what is shared use mobility? Shared use mobility is the use of a motor vehicle, bicycle, or other low-speed mode as an innovative transportation strategy to gain short-term access to a transportation mode on an as-needed basis. This can include car sharing, bike sharing, peer-to-peer models, ride sharing, and we're seeing people increasingly turn to these types of modes, shared modes, because of this, in part because of smartphone technology, making it easier, more convenient, and also the growth of the sharing economy and some of the trends I kind of talked about in terms of people looking for convenience, looking to multitask, looking for other ways to get from point A to point B and be efficient about doing it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about car sharing. Those of you that may be Car2Go users may actually recognize this is actually inside of a smart car. And there are 4 basic car sharing service models that have emerged. The first and kind of the original one was a round-trip model where people pay by the hour or by the mile or a combination of the two for a round trip. So they pick it up at point A, they return the vehicle back to point A, they use it to run errands. These might be people, for an example, that need a vehicle, don't own one, and they're doing trips like shopping. They're going to get groceries and don't want to have to carry them on the bus or something like that. The other model that we saw after the evolution of the round-trip model was peer-to-peer car sharing, where people are making their own private vehicles available when they're not in use for rent for other people. And there's a lot of various spin-offs of this model. I'm going to talk about Flight Car a little bit later about this. But it's happening in a variety of contexts in urban neighborhoods, at airports. There's a lot of move where people maybe need a vehicle, so they own one, but they want to earn extra money from the unused portion of that vehicle. The other model that we are seeing evolve has to do with one-way car sharing. This was the next service model to really evolve, and Car2Go here in Vancouver is a great example of that. And people pay by the minute for a one-way point-to-point service. So they are going from point A to point B and dropping off the vehicle. We're going to talk a little about some of the differences between these models a little bit later in the context of parking, but really what has enabled this to happen is both advancements in technology in the telematics allowing people to do that, as well as improvements in parking policy allowing people to pick up and park a vehicle anywhere. And then the other model that we see, which is relatively new, is a fractional ownership model. Audi is one company that is pioneering this in Europe, that they are bringing it to North America with some differences. But in Europe, what they are doing is allowing groups of people, 4 to 5 groups of friends or colleagues, to go out and purchase a car together and co-own and share the vehicle among themselves. So this is kind of another spin-off of kind of the car sharing model. So our research team over at UC Berkeley every 6 months collects data on car sharing in the Americas and every 2 years worldwide. This here is some basic statistics from Brazil, Mexico, Canada, and the United States. And what we see here is over the past 10 years is a steady increase in the number of car sharing members across the Americas. And we also see as of July 2014, almost 282,000 members in Canada and 1.3 million members in the United States. And this here is a similar figure showing the number of car sharing vehicles over the same period also, which has increased. And as of July 2014, there was about 5,000 vehicles in Canada and about 19,000 car sharing vehicles in the United States. And between this period, car sharing fleets between 2013 and 2014 grew at a rate of 28% in Canada and 14% in the United States. One of the ways that we measure how many people are impacted by these fleets and how intensive these fleets are used is known as member-to-vehicle ratios. And one of the things that I can tell you is that in Canada, the member-to-vehicle ratio as of this most recent period was 56 members per each car-sharing vehicle. And that number has consistently been a little bit higher in the United States. It's 70 to 1 in the United States, but in Canada that number has steadily risen over the past 10 years. So our research team did a study back in 2008 on the impacts of car sharing, and it involved a survey of approximately 9,500 people based on about 6,300 households. And it covered all of these programs in the United States and Canada, so it was a really, truly incredible industry-wide survey across North America at the time. As you can see in Canada, it represented AutoShare at the time, which is now part of Enterprise, but that was representing Toronto, Communauto in Montreal, Cooperative Auto Network, which is now Moto here in Vancouver, and Virtucar over in Ottawa. So one of the findings from this North American car sharing survey was that for each car sharing vehicle placed on the road for round trip car sharing, it removed between 9 to 13 privately owned vehicles off the road. That includes postponed vehicle purchases, and that 4 to 6 vehicles were sold due to car sharing. Of the survey population, about 25% sold a vehicle and about 25% postponed a vehicle purchase. In addition to this, we saw a reduction of vehicle miles, vehicle kilometers traveled of 27 to 43%, depending on whether you look at the full or the observed impact. And that overall, more users increased public transit and motorized and non-motorized modes such as bus, rail, walking, and carpooling than decreased it. Some of the other survey findings was that there was a net CO2 reduction of about 27% and a reduction of about 0.58 to 0.84 metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions per year per household. Again, the first one being mean observed impact, the other one being full impact. 34 to 41% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions per household, and a monthly savings ranging from $154 to $435 per U.S. member of car sharing. Actually, before I go on, I just want to go back to the slide real fast. This here is actually a photo here in Vancouver of Moto. Some of you guys kind of may recognize this downtown. Yeah, I'll take a question. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. In fact, and it kind of touches on it here briefly. Overall, and this is kind of a simplified version. I can send you kind of some more details later. But overall, in the study, it found that people walked more, used transit more, all of the above. Any questions on this? Yeah, I can send you more detailed statistics. I didn't have enough room on the slide. I got a lot of slides I'm going through today. So I wanted to touch on some parking developments in North America. You know, parking kind of represents, you know, the lifeblood of car sharing in many respects for multiple reasons. It's important to the operators from a financial perspective, from a marketing perspective, and it's important to the consumer both for convenience as well as visibility to see where vehicles are available. And Cooperative Auto Network, which is now known as Moto here in Vancouver, was actually one of the first North American operators to obtain universal parking permits, and they actually kind of pioneered this. And although Moto is a round-trip car-sharing system, what it enabled people to do was pick up a car-sharing vehicle and park it anywhere within the city of Vancouver in a parking permit, and kind of always have basically guaranteed parking throughout the day. So this was kind of an interesting kind of incentive for people to use car sharing from the parking perspective. One of the latest developments has to do with parking clustering with car-to-go vehicles being the one-way service model because they don't have a designated return spot being a free-floating system. And one of the things that is happening over in Calgary is that the Calgary City Council is starting to impose, and actually this has recently been approved since the slides were made, they've actually approved very clear guidelines as to how many vehicles can be allowed on a city block and when vehicles have to be moved or relocated. That this actually is a photo that was captured by a reader in Calgary and sent to their newspaper showing kind of an example of car-to-go vehicles stacked up. And this is a very sensitive issue, not just for car-to-go, but for everybody, because curb space represents a shared space that is desired by loading zones for taxis, for transportation network companies, for transit, for shuttles, for car sharing, for private parking, for bicycles. So this is a very sensitive issue that really hits home to many, many, many people. One of the other parking developments that we see going on is a new model known as FlightCar, which is a peer-to-peer system offering car sharing at 9 international airports in North America. This is a really fascinating development because what they are allowing people to do is to drive their personal vehicle to the airport, park for free, and then make their available for rental to inbound travelers. They get a fee for renting out their private vehicle, get their vehicle car washed, and then when they get back, they've got no parking bill to pay at the airport. So this is a really fascinating twist on kind of peer-to-peer car sharing. And so I want to kind of briefly touch on some of the highlights for car sharing for kind of 2015. The first one being for everybody here in BC is that at the Car Sharing Association, a network of worldwide car sharing operators, will be hosting their annual conference here in Vancouver, September 22nd to 23rd. That's available for anybody who wants to attend and participate. The other is the fractional ownership model that I kind of mentioned with Audi Unite, although that model is going to be a little bit different in North America, though we don't know what those differences are going to be yet. In addition to that, we see multimodal integration of bike sharing and car sharing, in particular with City Car Share in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then we also see a number of one-way electric vehicle model or service models launching. A planned later in the year shift in Las Vegas, and then Blue Indy in Indianapolis. Blue Indy is going to be based off the Autoliv model in Paris. So I'd like to talk a little bit about bike sharing, kind of shared use of bicycles on a short-term basis. This here you might recognize as a photo from Boston from the Hubway system. So in bike sharing, just like car sharing, there's also been a number of service models that have evolved, most of them being IT-based public bike sharing, where it's one-way, station-based. People like Bixby here in Canada, people go to a station, they check out a bike, they can return it to any other available station. That has emerged as kind of the most common model in North America, although not the only model. There are non-station based models, social bicycles known as SOBI, which just launched in Hamilton, Canada, being one of them, where users have the option of returning it to a kiosk one way, or locking it up anywhere within a geofenced area and paying a small premium to drop off the bicycle anywhere. So it's kind of a little bit of an interesting twist. The other one that we see is closed campus community bike sharing. So that would be systems, on like a university or an employer campus. And the final one is the growth of peer-to-peer bike sharing, where people can make their personal bicycles available for rent on a short-term basis, just like car sharing. And then we'll be talking a little bit about some technologies that are kind of enabling that and driving that. So our team has also done a number of bike sharing impacts. Excuse me. And we did a 2-year study of bike sharing impacts across North America, including Mexico, United States, and Canada. One of the things that we found, and there's a lot of complicated data I can go into on this, but I'm going to give you kind of the Cliff Notes version of this, is one of the fascinating things that we found was that urban form really impacts bike sharing usage and how they use bike sharing and whether or not they connect to transit. So one of the things that we found was that in smaller cities and in cities with very linear and relatively new rail networks, that bike sharing is used as a first to last mile connector where people are going to transit, getting on transit, and then getting off, possibly connecting to bike sharing on the other end. But this was very different than the way that bike sharing was being used in larger cities with much more complicated spaghetti-like rail networks. That people were in places like Washington, D.C., they were actually using bike sharing as a substitute for transit. The bike sharing trip was more direct, less crowded, maybe more affordable than taking transit, and they were using it to go from point A to point B on a faster basis. This was kind of an interesting development. There have been a lot of studies that have repeatedly shown this. Even our own study, which was a 2-year study, each year showed the same kind of effect. We also see people a little bit more apt to use bike sharing than taking the bus just on a typical basis. So we also partner with a number of people in the industry to track data for bike sharing. This data is from Russell Medin, and what he has basically concluded is that through his data collection is that worldwide there were 835 cities with bike sharing, just under 1 million bikes at about 45,000 different stations. In Canada alone, 4 cities with about 6,300 bicycles and 530 stations. That excludes social bicycles in terms of their stations because you don't have to return it to a station necessarily in their system. And then in the U.S., we've seen a really huge growth of bike sharing over the past 2 to 3 years. 68 cities now and about 22,000 bikes across almost 2,300 stations. Actually, this picture here is from Bixby over in Montreal. So some of the bike sharing highlights that we see is the recent launch of the North American Bike Share Association, kind of a trade association for North American bike sharing operators. We see the growth of campus-based systems. We're also seeing a growth of free-floating bike sharing, kind of like SOBI. This is actually a picture of their system here, kind of showing the telematics on the bicycle itself, and then kind of the smartphone. Since you don't have to return it to a kiosk necessarily, that's one of the ways people can access it if it's just dropped off at a non-station location. We see kind of the growth of e-bike sharing and car sharing and integrating that with bike sharing. And then we also see the development of a keyless bike lock system. In this case, one of them is known as BitLock. BitLock is kind of an interesting system because with BitLock, users can lock their bicycle via smartphone, via Bluetooth, They can also drop off their bicycle and share it with other people as well with their software application. These are going to start being delivered next month as far as the technology goes. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about ride sharing and for-hire vehicle services and clearing up a lot of confusion about this. So if I were to ask people if anybody knew the difference between Car2Go and Zipcar, how many people in the room know the difference? Okay, so maybe a third to half. Okay, so I'm going to kind of explain kind of the difference. Car2Go is car sharing, Uber, and how many people know the difference between Uber and like Zipcar? Uber and Lyft. Okay, it's the same number. So we talked about a little about the one-way service models. We're going to talk a little about for-hire vehicle services and kind of ride sharing. I'm going to talk about ride sharing first. The first one being carpooling. So with carpooling, it's pretty self-explanatory. A group of travelers, one or more, meet another traveler or driver, and they drive in a privately owned vehicle for commuting. Van pooling is kind of a spin-off of that same kind of theme, just a larger group of people typically traveling to a job center in a van. In addition to this, we see real-time ride-sharing services being enabled largely through internet and smartphone technology to match drivers and passengers based on destination through apps before their trip starts. And what's fascinating about this development is that increasingly a lot of platforms are incorporating social networking into this. So no longer do you have to go to a slug line and meet a carpooler you don't know. You can actually filter it out based on your Facebook or other social network. So our research group did a study of classic ride sharing back in 2011. We're in the process of updating new data, but back in 2011, we found 401 ride matching programs in the U.S., 261 in Canada, so 662, and 24 of these overlap between both countries. 153 were specific to van pooling, 612 were specific to carpooling, and 127 offered both of these services. Increasingly, with the development of smartphone technology and kind of apps, we're seeing a real blurring of the lines between what is ride matching, what is carpooling, what is a for-hire service. And I'm going to kind of go into the details of those. Mobile technology is allowing people to what's known as e-hail a vehicle. So instead of going onto a street and flagging down a cab, you can use a smartphone app to e-hail or dispatch a service. And we're seeing a lot of blurring between the lines between services that are offering more than one service model. Some are offering carpooling, ride matching, and then others, both same and different, are also offering for-hire services as well. And there's becoming less of a distinction between ride sharing and what's known as ride sourcing or transportation network companies, which is common in the United States. It's a common term. And really kind of what is determining this distinction is kind of the exchange of money. And really at the heart of it is whether it's a for-profit exchange or not. So you may carpool with somebody and exchange money for parking or for tolls or for gas. And what kind of distinguishes that between a for-hire service is the other person making a profit. So some of the for-hire service models that we have are advanced reservation model. This has long been around with taxi cabs. You can go book it via phone, website, or smartphone. The other service model is a street hail, going out onto a corner and flagging down a taxi would be an example. And then we also see e-hail, which I kind of briefly explained, dispatching using a smartphone application. And so this image here is a screenshot of Sidecar. It's a service fairly comparable to Uber or Lyft. That might be kind of a term that Uber you might be more familiar with here up in Canada since it's been in the news a lot. And it shows kind of the interface here. And you can see here that somebody can go onto the app based on their location. They can find an available driver, select a pickup on a drop-off location, and get an estimated cost. We've kind of coined the term ride sourcing because you're really sourcing rides from a driver pool. Some of the services that this can include are Uber, Lyft, Shuttle, Sidecar. The list kind of goes on and on. There's kind of new services all the time. And actually, I kind of want to go through kind of a couple brief highlights of some kind of the latest developments kind of here, kind of in Canada going on with these kind of services. One of the ones being from Manitoba in December 2014, where the provincial minister of municipal governments announced that anyone caught driving an Uber is violating the province's Taxi Cab Act and would be fined $1,000 per offense. That's kind of the latest development from their province. In Quebec, earlier this year, 2 drivers were fined and had their vehicles seized for driving for a fee without having a commercial license. One of the things that's going on in Vancouver this week is the city council is kind of debating about whether or not to extend the moratorium on Uber. I have not heard of what the resolution is from that in the papers yet. And then also going on as of yesterday and today in Alberta, the Court of Queen's Bench is actually going to hear a request for an injunction to stop Uber from operating in Edmonton. So those are kind of some of the latest developments kind of going on around Canada with these app-based services. Our research team did a study of ride sourcing in San Francisco and got some early understanding from it. Now, this is only from San Francisco with that caveat, but we asked the question of how would you have made this trip if Uber, Lyft, and Sidecar were not available? And what was interesting is 39% of the respondents said that they would have taken a taxi. 24% said they would have taken a bus. 9% would have taken rail. Only 6% would have driven their own car. So what this suggests to us is that people are using this in conjunction with transit, in conjunction with taxis, possibly as a substitute for those. 92% still would have made this trip. However, 8% did a new trip that they wouldn't have done before. 33%, as I said, would have taken some sort of form of transit. And what was interesting is that 4% named a transit station as their origin and destination, suggesting that some people might be using this as a first or last mile connector to get to transit. And repeatedly, we hear time and time again is that a lot of people are using this to avoid drinking and driving, 20% in this particular case, and that we had a large number of respondents that were using it in the evening time and on the weekend periods. So one of the interesting developments has to do with insurance, and this was an issue that was highlighted in San Francisco a couple of years ago when a little girl was hit and killed by a transportation network company driver distracted on their app on their phone. And so one of the developments has been a lot of activity in the insurance realm, and we see 4 app kind of periods that have been kind of defined, and this is a figure our research group came up with. The first one is kind of the app is off, your private insurance, kind of covers. But beyond that, from period 2 through 4, we see a lot of places up in arms about how to address the insurance issue. So if you have the app on and you're waiting for a ride, does your personal vehicle coverage cover you, or does it some sort of commercial policy? And then along that same lines, if you have multiple apps open, because some people drive for more than one service, and you get into an accident or some sort of traffic incident, and you have to make an insurance claim, whose insurance which app does it cover? The other period that we see is the ride match period, the en route to pickup. that is somebody who has already accepted a ride. They're going to pick up their passenger. And then the final one is the trip period. And what's interesting is that the Insurance Bureau of Canada has also gotten involved in this up here as well. And the Bureau has said that it is unclear whether drivers pick up passengers using a fare should be covered under personal or commercial policies. So they have not taken a stand on this yet, but they are aware that this is an issue. And in the United States, we see a lot of varying actions on this, from consumer advisories to mandated insurance coverage and everything in between. So some of the industry developments kind of going on here with kind of ride sourcing is known as ride splitting, as well as fare splitting and ride sourcing. And so I'm going to kind of go on, kind of talk to you guys about those. Ride splitting is kind of a matching service that allows you to kind of pick up a ride with somebody else, with a friend, and then take ride sourcing within a TNC. So it kind of helps you kind of pair up your ride with another person. In addition to that, we also see what's known as fare splitting, and they're kind of confusing. They're kind of, people tend to kind of lump the two together. Ride splitting would be sharing a ride. Fare splitting would include sharing a ride, but splitting the fare. So this would be like, taking a taxi cab with somebody else and then splitting the fare. And so we see a lot of developments in that realm to try to provide enhanced services. We also, an example is Via in Manhattan, which kind of merges aspects of taxis and TNCs, and drivers and vehicles are contracted to a taxi and limo company, and they offer shared rides and various flat rate fares. Some of the other industry developments going on in the carpooling realm is Karma. So we see apps that are working to do ride matching and are kind of doing the smartphone app bit for actual carpoolers. We also see some spin-offs of this with kind of non-tech modes as well. Karma Hop is an example of one in Kansas, in a university town, where riders write their destination on a whiteboard and then transfer it to a smartphone and pick up drivers along the way. And then we see things like Commuter, which is trying to replicate the idea of slugging last minute kind of on a smartphone application. In addition to all this, we see a number of industry developments with the taxi industry. The taxi industry is also trying to change as well, and one of the things that they are doing is developing taxi applications that allow people to see the location of their cab, select a cab, and also pay electronically. We see a number of e-hail apps. This is an example of Flywheel, kind of showing their interface. One of the other things that we see is, in some cases, people or municipalities mandating these apps. So in Los Angeles, taxis will have to implement a mandatory taxi app for e-hailing beginning August 20th. And those that fail to do so will have fines of $200 per day per driver for noncompliance. So that's one way that regulation is impacting this as well. And in Toronto, another example, Beck Taxi is actually testing their own smartphone app that it plans on deploying later this year voluntarily. So some of the highlights for ride sharing and ride sourcing is we kind of see it beginning to kind of address latent demand for urban travel and offer a lot of point-to-point services. I think you guys can kind of get the idea, talking about one-way car sharing, one-way bike sharing, as well as ride sourcing. We're seeing a lot of increasing demand for one-way services in a variety of modes. The impacts of these services is still unclear because we have a lack of studies and a lack of data. That's something that we hope to address going forward and kind of better understand kind of the role in our transportation network. And then we also see a lot of emerging public policy on insurance, driver and vehicle safety checks, background checks. How do we manage new modes within existing legacy modes? So how do we manage transportation network companies alongside taxis? One of the things that I can say here is that's very much involved in this is the politics of taxi licenses, often known as medallions. In Boston, these licenses to operate per cab cost $800,000. In New York City, it peaked at over $1 million, and that these medallions are traded like an investment, and they consistently outperform the S&P 500. So there's a lot of money on the line with the owners of these medallions, and that plays into a lot of politics. Here in British Columbia, these licenses are estimated at over $800,000 from kind of a recent news report on this. And there haven't been any new taxi licenses issued here in BC in 25 years. So part of the issue with this pricing is a supply and demand issue. And ultimately, what we're going to need is more research to kind of inform kind of where regulation should go, or deregulation in that regard as well. So to summarize kind of some of the things that we talked about today, we looked at kind of the paradigm shift, kind of the idea that access is trumping ownership in some respects. We looked at the definition of shared use mobility and common shared use services. We looked at kind of talked about the complex travel behaviors that are going on, the demographic shifts with the millennial population, the fact that more and more people, particularly millennials, but not only millennials, they're wanting to use their commute for multiple things during the day. They're wanting to exercise, they're wanting to check email, they're wanting to start work. They're using the commute for a lot of different purposes. And the increasing importance of smartphone and web-based technologies as having a driving factor on our transportation system. We also looked at all these shared use modes, car sharing, bike sharing, ride sharing, for hire services. And I'd like to thank kind of the San Jose State Mineta Transportation Institute, the California Department of Transportation, and my colleagues over at UC Berkeley, including Susan Shaheen and Elliot Martin and others, as well as the mobility operators and experts who make our research possible. This here is our website for more information on our research. I guess now we'll open it up to questions. I don't know who's moderating. Okay.
So thanks a lot, Adam. It's really interesting stuff, fascinating develops. I guess, so I have sort of two questions that kind of relate to the implications for health. One is a little bit more abstract. So if you look at sort of life cycle energy use or greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles, much of it is, people don't realize this, but much of it is actually the manufacture of the vehicle, not how you use it or what fuel you use. And so the big sort of unmet demand for vehicles is in developing countries. It seems like that's where a lot of the sort of sharing technologies could perhaps prevent these vehicles from ever being made. Mm-hmm. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about any examples in developing countries. And then the second question is sort of more general, sort of what do you see as actually the implications for health of all of what you talked about?
Okay. Two wide questions. I'll start with the first one, developing countries. And developing countries is actually a little bit more of a complicated one than a simple answer for a lot of different reasons. We have a lot of examples of developing countries employing shared use mobility, car sharing being a main one, but we also see like RIDESOURCING, the TNCs also in a number of places. India being a prime example for one. The reason that ends up being a little bit kind of a complicated scenario in the developing countries is both the labor as well as the broader economics of it. Vehicles in a lot of developing countries tend to be purchase secondhand, so they're buying used vehicles from the developed world. And so the economics of vehicles, although their income is lower, the vehicles are also lower in cost because of the high number of used vehicles in the market. They also happen to get, because they're getting a lot of older used vehicles, they're also getting some of the most polluting vehicles left in the fleet. So there's that aspect. The other aspect is labor. Low labor costs has been a significant issue in the developing world, which in one respect has supported shared use mobility, but in the other respect has made it a little bit more complicated. Because when you have somebody that may only get $1 a day and works very low wage, it's easy to shuttle things around. So that's one aspect that makes it easier. So like one-way services, we saw in a lot of locations where services were using low-wage employees to actually shuttle bicycles or vehicles around. The other challenge, that's kind of an opportunity. One of the challenges we also see is the digital divide and the connectivity issue. With all of these shared use services, for the most part, there have been historically manual operations. A physical exchange of keys potentially, or coin deposit, bike sharing system. But with that being said, the electronics of the more advanced systems are a challenge. And what's interesting is it kind of depends. I mean, there's parts of the developed world that have very sophisticated mobile phone technologies. There's other parts that don't. So I don't know if that fully answered kind of your question on that. With regards to, can you repeat your question on the health aspect? Well, as far as the transportation network companies go, as I said, the research still needs to be done there because we don't have enough research to know the full impacts there. But in the context of car sharing and bike sharing, a round trip car sharing study showed one, car sharing vehicle removed between 9 to 13 personal vehicles off the road. So that's definitely a congestion mitigation benefit as well as an air quality improvement there. And then we also bike sharing for a lot of obvious reasons as well.
I'm interested because you've got both the kind of legal background and the community planning background, and so I'm interested in your thoughts on what is needed to change this kind of taxi situation, the legal situation, what has to happen to move that forward.
This is a question that I get asked all the time, and my colleagues and I disagree quite substantially on this. To be perfectly blunt, in my personal opinion, this is my personal opinion, I think devolution or deregulation is the best thing for everybody. I kind of view what's going on in the taxi TNC realm very similar to what happened in North America with airline regulation, 20 to 30 years ago. And what we saw, after deregulation of airlines was all these low-cost carriers that proliferated, and there was the legacy airlines were stuck with old contracts and higher cost service models, and ultimately for them they had to go through bankruptcy really to become competitive with the post deregulation carriers. But in many respects, I see what's going on is kind of a couple things. The taxis, everybody has had a situation where you try going to get to the airport, whether it be a friend or a taxi or whatever, and they're not there. Where are they? Am I going to be able to get there? So on and so forth. The issue is when your friend is late, you know how to call your friend, how to reach them. But when you're trying to get a taxi, you don't know who your driver is. You don't have direct contact with them. You can't get a status update. And what kind of manifests is that if you can't get a taxi to go to the airport, all of a sudden or if you're concerned they're running late or you're anxious, and you call up to get another taxi, one of two things is going to happen. It's either going to roll over to the same dispatcher, because one dispatcher typically operates multiple taxi companies in a lot of markets, or you're going to get another taxi, and it's going to take away from somebody else, and it creates a real inefficiency in the system. So on one aspect, from a service model, it's, I think, imperative that the industry-wide, goes to the smartphone capability of being able to see your location, your driver, electronic payment, everything goes along with the convenience of that. Okay. Another thing I think that's driving that trend towards the popularity of something like Uber isn't necessarily the taxi's fault, but it's kind of the McDonald's of transportation. The idea that you can download one app, and if you're a business traveler, you can go anywhere in the world and get off and get the exact same driver, essentially, service to pick you up. You don't have to worry about, do I need to exchange currency to pay? Do I need to download a local app? Will I be able to understand the local language? All of that is taken out of that. So that's another thing that's driving kind of this multinational TNC trend. Ultimately, I think the way to get around that is a real devolution in the regulation. And so you have a minimum amount of regulation for all for-hire vehicle services. It's all the same. We do away with this medallion business because it's created a real supply problem. And what's interesting is I've heard from a lot of taxi drivers, the taxi lobby is not all the same, and it's not the same players in it. And there's a lot of taxi drivers out there that either leave to go drive for Uber for various reasons, or there's a lot of taxi drivers that want to see deregulation also, because in a lot of markets, they will pay $75,000 a year to rent out these medallions, and that's just taken off the top.
One more, quickly.
I was just going to add to that locally. I mean, we've got this situation in Vancouver, for example, where only certain taxi companies can pick up in certain parts of the city. So you can get a fare, like where you're driving from the airport into downtown. That cab can't pick up a return fare; it has to go back to the airport, which is really inefficient. And that's all the tight regulation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, everyone, we are at time, and thank you very much for joining us today and for joining us all term, and we'll see you again in September. Thank you very much, Adam, for joining us here today and telling us about something we probably never would have heard about otherwise.